We were just saying, I think that there should have been all of the above on that question, actually, in terms of the issues to be faced, which I think we'll get into in this panel in a bit of depth, actually. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. I think preventing financial crime on a global basis really is a issue that unites both the public and private sector in terms of finding collaboration on action. And there are good reasons for that. From a global perspective, money laundered each year equates to 2 to 5% of global GDP. There are major issues in terms of systemic financial stability impacts from illicit financial flows. There are issues relating to financial inclusion in emerging markets from economic crime, and certainly really drilling down into the effects of what financial crime actually means and the effects of the societal ills that it contributes to. It contributes to terrorism, proliferation finance, drug smuggling, wildlife poaching, human trafficking, modern slavery. All of these issues are things that really need to be developed and worked on in terms of finding solutions in a public and private sector cooperative way. We at the IIF have been working for a number of years on these particular issues. Most recently, we published a report this week that, in collaboration with Deloitte, that focused on the end-to-end view of financial crime risk management, looking at areas where enablers to make the system more effective would help in the fight against financial crime on a global basis. And that includes information sharing, public-private partnerships, the use of data, and the use of technology. And today, we're very pleased to have a real expert group across the spectrum of individuals to talk about this issue in a good deal of depth, to really talk about where effectiveness can be driven in the global financial system for fighting financial crime, both from a private sector perspective, law enforcement, regulatory, and supervisory perspective. So to begin with, very much like to hand over to Jay Collins from Citi to talk a little bit about, Jay, what, in your view, take a big picture view on all of this as well. In 10 to 15 years, if we're looking for greater effectiveness in the system, a better way of managing financial crime risk and getting to the core elements of what's wrong with the system, what would you say would be the key enablers?
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank IIF, and for those of you that haven't yet had a chance to read it, take a look at this report. We sat in a room, several of us, is at the beginning of this year, Deloitte and some members of law enforcement, and just said, you know, if you could dream big, if you took a blank piece of paper out and kind of set legacy aside for a moment and all of the challenges that people have been fighting since the 70s and really wanted to dream big and make a difference in financial crime, what would you do? And I think we all turned to IIF as a resource to help us get there. And so I just commend this report to you. So, you know, if you're explaining to your 18-year-old daughter, as I tried to do, you know, why it is that $2 trillion of financial crime a decade ago is still $2 trillion of financial crime as the ultimate enabler of criminality in the world as we know it across all areas. You know, what would you do to make that difference? Well, you know, first, you'd start with the ability of banks to form collaborative utilities to share data and information, not only amongst themselves cross-border, but effectively with the system and a circle of trust group of banks that could collaborate to go after that. And so that's a starting point. Second is we would move from a massively expensive and complicated manually driven system to a world of the new digital reality. And we'd be taking all of the tools, human-assisted AI of big data tools, so that we could take the vast amount of information that we all have that is so siloed and compartmentalized, and you would aggregate that and use AI to essentially bring a spotlight into the dark room of bad actors and go after them methodically, again with human assisted, but taking away at its core a lot of the manual. That, you know, fundamentally we would have a top-down strategic prioritization of highly useful information, starting with BS at, you know, kind of the beginning of the mandate of highly useful information, as opposed to a system where 0.05% of the kind of alert to SARS process actually ends up at the back end getting investigated. And you would have a strategic dialogue with law enforcement that prioritizes the biggest actors, let's just say the top dozen actors in the world that are multi-regional, meaning the global in nature, that are operating across every one of the major crime activities of the world, and you would prioritize them strategically, and you would push that mandate down from the top of our organizations and institutions. And then, of course, you would have a law, I think, a law enforcement-driven dialogue that says to national decision-making bodies, governments, policymakers, with regulators and with the banks, is this is what we need. This is what you have to give us to fight financial crime, so that it's law enforcement-driven in nature over time, and that we redesign what is most necessary for this new world. And then importantly, we would have a new dynamic of public-private partnership, and I think that was what jumped out here in terms of your sense of the importance of more formal PPPs, but also it jumps out in the report as just critical. And some of the sessions we've had with law enforcement and banks in the room, there is a need for and there's such a transition now across all of the things at the IMF, World Bank, of this sense of trust and collaboration between the private sector, regulation, law enforcement, to work on big problems together, but to re-engineer some of the PPP frameworks and to replicate, the ones that are working. There are a number of unofficial, official, GIMLET as an example, that really work, that can be cloned, both at a national level, but then mechanisms to better collaborate faster and across border. So I think that all of these things, of course, have to be done with respect to the data privacy issues of our time, but also to incorporate them in legal and regulatory policy frameworks that allow for better PPPs and collaborative mechanisms to be sharpened, and the report points to a number of those, which I think we'll go into in a minute.
Excellent, thank you. And the report, it's available on your app as well, and it really encompasses surveys across all jurisdictions of the public and the private sector on issues for effectiveness in the system. And indeed, the public-private partnership piece was a key element to that. Marcus Wogart from HSBC. As co-chair of the Wolfsburg Group, you have an interesting vantage point in all of this across the global system. I wonder if you could respond to some of the points Jay raised, some of those enablers, but also talk a little bit about the role of international institutions, associations in advancing this particular agenda and increasing effectiveness.
Well, I think if we look at the current round of FATF evaluations and the focus on effectiveness, we're really beginning to see how we can drive the right risk-mitigated outcomes for the societies in which we operate. And the move from a mere focus on technical compliance, getting the laws in place, harmonizing the regulations globally, to how they are implemented, enforced, and acted upon is, I think, the key first step in that effectiveness journey for the world as a whole. I think it's clear if you put a simple scoring methodology on those reports that perhaps the best country is only at 70% effectiveness. So it just shows you how far we still have to go on this journey in terms of driving the right outcomes. However, the Wolfsburg Group of banks and mine, HSBC, are firmly behind this agenda and think that what is key is how do we drive a an agreement, as you just heard there from Jay, between not just law enforcement, but law enforcement, regulators, and government as to what are the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve through the system. And that's going to be different in different countries, right? But what we see is still a immaturity in the risk assessments that those countries are doing, and a lack of fulsome dialogue between the parties in achieving those outcomes. Now, we've had some very, very positive results, as you've heard there on Gimlet. And it's not just in Gimlet. We've seen it in Australia and Singapore. At the fund yesterday, the head of FinTrack was talking about some amazing outcomes in relation to what they've shared data in human trafficking terms. And I think as we progress those initiatives, even though they are the tip of the iceberg in terms of number of investigations, it is beginning to open up the trust between these counterparties, these stakeholders, to drive an agenda that hopefully, particularly for the major banks that are absolutely essential for the operation of the system, if there is this balance between what technical compliance can give a country and a bank and what is the value add of these effectiveness agendas, then suddenly we're moving into a completely different way that we regulate and a different way that we operate and the way that we can start showing real bang for our buck. Because I don't think there's any bank that is not committed to putting the dollars behind it. I just think that what we are trying to explain to our C-suite executives is that that is achieving real outcomes rather than just tick box compliance. And that is the big focus that we're trying to drive in Wolfsburg, is that we are committed to doing the right things in the societies that we serve and the expectations of our regulators. We just want to evolve that dialogue to focus on the plethora of challenges that we see. And I think for us, the big enabler is going to be the technology agenda. And particularly, for example, NHSBC, we've spent a lot in terms of driving forward an intelligence-led financial crime risk management set of tools, frameworks, methodologies, and aspirations in terms of how do we get real time about managing risk. And I think we've seen some very, very powerful examples historically in the fraud space, but more recently in the cyber fraud and the cyber space, in terms of how, when institutions and governments trade information in real time, we actually get the right outcomes. And therefore, if we can start sharing those methodologies particularly in the transaction monitoring space, where we have the agility and ability to put in controls and spot risk as it occurs and share that and those methodologies across our member banks and across the relevant stakeholders that I've just spoke about, suddenly we're going to start achieving those effectiveness outcomes. So I think those are some of the things that we're focusing on, but without a harmonized understanding of what our risks are, a harmonized set of rule books, a harmonized set of regulations that are implemented in the same way, and some real teeth behind an agenda from all countries in terms of asset seizure, when we see that only 0.2% of the 1% of the 2 trillion is actually being targeted, are we really going to be effective and start showing our public that we're reducing harm?
And that's really come across. And the tick-the-box approach to an outcomes-based approach really is a necessary move. We'll get to the technology piece in a moment, which I think is very important. But to Sarah, I mean, you've had a very interesting vantage point from having been at Treasury, been part of the FATF, and now in the private sector institution. There are obviously significant barriers to effectiveness, and may I posit that information sharing might be one of the most significant. But from your perspective, where would you see those barriers being the most significant, and how should we move to overcome some of those barriers?
Thanks, Matt, and thanks so much for inviting me to be here. It's great to be amongst a lot of old friends, actually, up here. So it is an interesting perspective, and it's funny, Juan and I were chatting before we came up here about that list that was up, and he was sort of questioning the importance or the weight that may be put on having a harmonization of rules globally. And I said actually going into the firm now, coming from because I always thought, well, that's what FATF does. That's why we have FATF, so that everybody has the same rules. But there is so much nuance in how those are actually drafted and applied. I know that's not what you wanted me to talk about, but I did just touch on that because it is so much harder than I anticipated, particularly if you're not a U.S.-led firm. Right, so there's a really interesting piece to that, I think, too. In terms of the barriers and information sharing, and I'll talk about, look, there are two reasons why, or one reason why we're all talking about, public-private partnerships and technology. It's because we are all hoping, amongst all hope, that those are the two things that are going to help all of us as firms and as countries jump into the next game of AML, right? That's why we're all talking about it. Because we all see tremendous opportunities, and there are two key elements that have been identified to help us collectively be more effective. So in terms of the information sharing challenges, I actually think it's a really interesting question in the PPP space. Because one of the massive challenges across the board is they're twofold, right? So you have the ability to share information, government to private sector within one jurisdiction. The purpose of PPPs and really the way we all operate, all of us, and the way criminals operate is cross-border. Well, the multilateralization of PPPs is almost impossible because we can't share our data within our institutions, let alone bring it all together, sit with governments collectively. The real winner here is, a number of governments and the largest firms in a room together and looking at anonymized data, however we want to do it. That's how we would actually knock this out of the park.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, that is, in the words of the debate this week, a pipe dream at the moment. And so the really cool thing about PPPs actually is the fact that a lot of jurisdictions didn't have laws on the books to allow the private sector to share with governments. That didn't exist. And that's actually something that all of these partnerships have pushed, which is the necessary precursor to the multilateralization. So CS participates in the Europol program in Europe. I think all of us see tremendous hope in these as a way to, we all want to do better. We all want better outcomes. So we invest a lot in them and think we're very important. I think there's a technological side too. So as a firm, we're investing very heavily in building a lot of our own next generation systems, including the capacity to actually look holistically, globally across the firm at our customers, which is a huge challenge, not just from a data integration, clean data, and then being able to actually bring it all together, which we can do in one place, which is Switzerland. But Lynn working through how we provide access to that in different places, pending different requirements and rules in different places. But it's fundamental to risk management. To me, that's like 101. And I just want to pick up on one more thing, if I may, which is this outcomes issue. I obviously agree very much in the focus on effectiveness and, worked very hard with others in FATF to develop that agenda. I think there's a view, and I'll maybe put Marcus a little bit on the spot. I think in the context even of FATF, there's a recognition that we need to do better at defining what those outcomes are. What does effectiveness look like? And this is the same challenge we have, and what Marcus, I think, from a bank's perspective, we need people to help us know what good is. What is a useful SAR, right? What are the outcomes, the universe of outcomes? And you named some of them, but we actually need to have more granularity around what it is we're trying to achieve. Obviously, we can't just say fight financial crime. The obvious ones are, more money laundering and terrorist financing prosecutions, more assets seized. But there are 1,000 other possible buckets in there. And in order for us to help to be effective as firms, to analyze and provide data, to then provide it to governments to allow them to analyze and investigate and prosecute, we need to know what you want, right? It's really simple. It's like you can only provide when you know the best thing, when you know what it is that is going to be the most useful. So I think that's a dialogue that's ongoing also globally and is super important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important indeed. Let's transition. I think everyone's touched a bit on technology. So Juan, from your perspective, we're looking at a new paradigm in terms of a lot of ways of looking at how to deal with financial crime risk management, to deal with compliance and financial crime issues. Where are you seeing in terms of the biggest enablers for that from a technology perspective? Is it machine learning? Is it better use of digital identity? Is it use of new technology that enables the transfer of data by dealing with some of the privacy issues that we're dealing with on information sharing?
Matthew, I think the easy answer is all of the above.
Well, of course.
Right? But first of all, I want to say good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to you and to Tim Adams at IF for inviting me to be part of this great panel. I'm already learning a lot. I think what's interesting about this discussion and the question about technology, and Matthew, I promise I'll answer your question directly in a second, is the context in which we're having it. Because I think everything that we're talking about here is possible because there's three things happening in the environment. One, there is this quest for effectiveness at the jurisdictional level, at the institutional level, with a very deep and fundamental question as to whether or not the AML CFT system is fit for purpose for what we're asking it to do, right? In the last 20 years, we've asked the system to be systemically relevant, preventative, and we've asked it to deal with the hardest, both national security issues and transnational criminal issues. Matthew, you went through the list, and the list keeps getting longer and longer, right? So there is this question and this quest for effectiveness in the system, right? So that's first and foremost. Second is there's a need for efficiency. We know that the system is just wholly inefficient. When we have false positive rates for transaction monitoring systems that are at the core of the systems for major global institutions hitting 98, 99%, and most of the man hour spent on chasing false positives and alerts that have no meaning either to the institution in terms of management of risk or to public authorities that are trying to find bad guys or stop the next criminal network or attacks. That's a fundamental problem in question. And I think that's the realization that we're all facing, that the system that we designed in the 1970s and 80s to really be about following the money, building cases, helping law enforcement, is not the system that we have currently designed or what we've asked of it. And so there is an intense need for efficiency because we are just spending dollars in the wrong places for the wrong reasons. The third element of the environment is the fact that technology is all around us. The financial sector is swimming in an environment where there is innovation happening in all quarters of society and business, and the financial community and sector is frankly catching up, and the regulators are as well. You see this most acutely in the payment context, where there is so much need and innovation happening in the payments domain, and the financial sector both internally and exogenously trying to invest in or take advantage of those opportunities. So I wanted to just back the lens out because I think those three elements of the environment are forcing us to think differently about what both the challenges are as well as the opportunities. Now, what tech is doing is it's enabling three different things. One is it's allowing us to think about how can we improve, and we're very privileged to work with HSBC on the ILF CRM model that they're talking about. And so the question is, how can institutions use their data better? How can they cleanse it, validate it, and then ultimately use it better and for risk management? And so there's a whole suite of technologies and service providers that have emerged along the lanes of those necessities, right? The ability to acquire more data and different kinds of data, including biometrics. Yesterday I met with a new company I'd never heard of before that's trying to apply facial recognition technology to embed in the KYC process for financial institutions. And so you turn the corner and you find new technologies along every segment of this. In terms of transaction monitoring, the use of artificial intelligence has now become the holy grail of trying to use data more efficiently and effectively, and ultimately to find ways of automating the use, Jay, to your earlier point. And then finally, how do you actually think about the use of technology in different ways to not only manage historical risks or historical paradigmatic problems, but to find new opportunities, right? Where can we use the knowledge about our customers better, knowledge about geographies, knowledge about product lines to actually create business opportunities? And so it's this blending of financial crime risk management with business opportunity. So that's happening at the first level, which is how can we just improve the system as it exists now, use the technology that's in the environment, and just get better. The second thing that technology is allowing is it's opening the imagination and the aperture to do everything that I think all of the folks on this panel have talked about over the course of years, and that Jay was referring to, that I hope is in the report. I haven't read it yet, honestly. And that is, what does the next generation of this system and design look like? Because the current system and design is ineffective, inefficient, and isn't meeting the policy goals or the market needs that we've asked of that system. And so technology is allowing us to think very aggressively about what those new designs look like. I'll give you two examples. One is this idea of a utility model. Jay, you pointed it out. We're working with Intel and another technology company called Giant Oak to actually experiment around the idea of a utility between similarly situated institutions to be able to share transactional analysis among their data sets without having to move the data. That is to say, the data resides in situ, and the utility is less about congregating all the data in a data lake, which we know is very sticky, very hard, contrary to a lot of these data localization laws, now 84 in place around the world. And so are there ways of thinking about the exposing of risk that individual institutions themselves wouldn't find, but collectively would learn and would discover together? And if you add artificial intelligence or machine learning on top of it, it is even more revelatory, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's one idea that's out there. The other is the idea of a gimlet or a consortium that begins to focus on priority issues for a jurisdiction or like-minded even countries. And so you have regulators like Singapore MAS thinking about what a regulatory hub looks like for management of financial crime risk. And so they've invested in a number of pilots to see what does that potentially look like. If Singapore is both exposed to this risk but also wants to be an attractive capital center, what does that look like for the region? And so they're piloting, and many of you may be involved in this, piloting some very interesting projects to see what those cross-border data sharing, data analysis systems could look like. The third thing that technology allows for is actually a solution to a lot of the policy tensions that we see beginning to emerge. Because if we imagine the use of technology to share data more effectively, to analyze it more quickly, for it to be more predictive and preventative, and to do so at real time, that's incredibly effective and efficient, but it creates some policy tensions. There are tensions around data privacy localization and the idea that data can flow anywhere, anytime, globally, right? So we're right in the middle of that grand debate. It was the first answer in the question there posed to the group. Technology perhaps has a solution to that policy tension, right? So you think about distributed ledger technologies that are now being experimented with in terms of payment systems or blockchain FX models. If you look at the ability to use federated learning models of the type that I described in the utility, that's a way of solving the data localization issue while accessing the data with the analytics. You have questions about whether or not transparency and security can actually mesh. Is there a clash of regimes between ultimate transparency and security? That gets to some of the things that Sarah was talking about, anonymization, hashing, other technologies that the privacy sector is innovating around precisely because of the tension for the need for more information, like ultimate beneficial ownership, but frankly the need for more privacy when we know autocratic regimes around the world are trying to use more data to understand more about their populations and even to suppress human rights and individual liberties. And so there's a dimension of technology that can perhaps find a solution to that policy tension. And there are others, of course. I can go down the line. But what's interesting here is technology is helping us begin to solve problems as to how we deal with the current state of play, the current paradigm. It's opening up the aperture for a very different model or design, potentially, that has a public-private dimension to it as well. And then it begins to help us solve problems that we're already seeing on the horizon around the use of these new technologies, the use of prediction, prevention, the ability to ensure financial inclusion while being preventative around financial crime risk management. So I'm incredibly bullish. We do a lot of work trying to scan the landscape. We meet with dozens of technology firms all the time to understand what's happening in the sector. And one of the things we're going to be doing with HSBC is traveling around the world to understand what the next generation of the regime looks like, both currently and what is in the realm of the possible.
That's great. I want to go back to some of the points, especially around the balance between new technologies and also the regulatory impetus for use of those technologies. But first, I want to go to the other Marcus from FATF, Vice President of FATF, which we're very pleased to have you fly directly from the FATF plenary to be with us in the G20 this week. So the FATF has been around for 30 years this year. A lot has been accomplished in terms of building the system to fight financial crime on a global basis. You're critical to that global coordination, global coherence in terms of how the system is being developed. And crucially, I think you're also the first organization to really review the effectiveness of your standards and how they're actually implemented around the world. You've heard colleagues on the private sector side in a lot of these areas. Can you talk a little bit about the FATF agenda on a lot of these points, how you would see effectiveness and how you would see FATF drive the effectiveness agenda?
Yes, of course. So thank you so much for having me here. And maybe I can quickly jump on the issues that the colleagues mentioned here, and then I will come to FATF's agenda. I mean, of course, digitization is changing everyone's life, and it's not stopping at AML, CFT. So I absolutely agree with all what you said. I think we have to be a little bit careful where this is perhaps developing. You are all from the private sector, I'm from the public sector, but I would say we also have to see the limits of data protection, privacy, and we don't want a big brother state in the end, right? So that's the only limit I see here, but I'm very sure that in 10 years' time, the AML-CFT world will look very different from today. FATF is looking, or since I think Sarah Renji has left us, and that's long ago, FATF has looked into the fintech area, has looked into the potential of subtech and regtech, and we will have a supervisors forum in 6 weeks' time in China under the Chinese presidency, and there we will look into how supervision can be improved by these new technologies, and also how the FIUs can use artificial intelligence, for example. When I was a child, I wondered why this world has not one government and one rules with all the problems that we have. But that's, of course, a childish imagination, and but to be honest, and you mentioned this, FATF is the first organization that not only looks at the technical compliance, but that really looks in what is the practical impact on the ground in the countries. So I'm the vice president maybe because I am closest to my childish imaginations, because we indeed look in not only into the jurisdictions of FATF, which has 39 jurisdictions, but in the global network, which consists of 205 countries. So tell me who is looking into actually in all countries of the world whether rules are really implemented. I mean, we will never see complete harmonization. The European Union struggles with harmonizing its law for the last 60 years. And there are still these nuances and split in regulations. And sometimes maybe this is even useful because we have different traditions, legal traditions, different cultures, mentalities. So there perhaps is also a need of differentiations between the countries. But in the AML-CFT areas, I think when I compare this with other areas of banking, we are quite far with trying to get a harmonized law book, rule book, and assessing the countries. So FATF is, as you say, now in its 30th year, and this is time to reflect whether our mutual evaluations should be improved. And this is why under the Chinese presidency a process was launched, a so-called strategic review, where we look at the results And there's, for example, one result I want to share with you, and that is that the effectiveness of supervision and preventative measures by banks and others, we have a 75% of countries assessed so far that fail on supervision. We have 100% of countries that fail of preventative measures. So you see there is still a lot to do, and we are now looking into how we can reform our MER process, make it more targeted, more risk-based. The last 10 years we have assessed countries in a clear order, not looking at the risks of the countries when we made the order of checking the countries. So that is something we are now reflecting on, and this, I think, would also improve FATF as an organization.
Excellent, thank you very much. Jay, from your perspective, what?
Yeah, well,
what you
I'd
want
just
to-
like to reinforce a little bit of some fantastic things I've heard. So first, I guess the I started off by saying try and explain to your 18-year-old daughter why we can't fix this, and that this dream that you can't figure it out. And part of it is just being able to break it down into what we can actually do. Starting with that 10-year dream that I kind of laid out. But so there are a couple things, I think. First of all, and I give Europol a fantastic credit for the way they've conceptualized some of this. But first and foremost was just to say, in terms of the legal regulatory restrictions, sharing strategic threat analysis amongst a circle of trust, we can do. Sharing typologies around how they are actually operating, what they're doing, how they're thinking, and how they're pivoting in a technological world, we can do. Operationalizing that is a whole nother story. But we should start with what we can do. We should start with enforcing what FATF has given us and some of what the regulatory and legal framework already allows us to do that we don't really either culturally take advantage of, or bank regulatory fear factors, concerns don't take advantage of. So that's a first. I mean, you start with acknowledging that to your 18-year-old that it's not working. And that it's actually, that the implications and risks we run by not fixing it are enormous, and then start to bucket it. The next thing I'd say is that I think you pointed out fantastically that this concept of one big target-rich pool that's not the dream, so to speak, because actually technology doesn't require that, and that's sometimes misunderstood. And so there's an education process that's necessary around what technology can do, that actually can protect data privacy norms. And if you look at, I see government officials all day, every day. That's all I do. And the education level and understanding is so low compared to where it needs to be, because both in terms of the technology and then let's talk about operationalizing at the national level. So, the conversation with this circle of trust of Europol is two things. One is, why not take what has worked? Let's just say, I'm picking on Gimlet as a fantastic example, but as you said, there's others. But let's just take one, kind of 80-20 rule. Why don't we clone that in circle of trust nations real fast and make sure at a national level we can do that? Because then this dream of hub and spokes to those that cloned it across border, not the whole world. We don't need to talk global, multinational. How about just talking about the ones that, a la MAS in Singapore, that could actually think about who would you connect into that and how fast. Actually, that's not a dream. That could be doable, and it can be doable within a reasonable period of time. And then finally, one of the elephants in the room is that there is a circle of trust issue. And so if you think of what circle of trust means in the cyberspace, right? And we think about how fast national state actors and cross-border actors are morphing between financial crime seamlessly and the cyberspace, we all need to think the same way about both the morphing of that, but also who are we really talking about needs to be in the room. And it's extremely sensitive as a proposition, even. But we have to get comfortable faster with those circle of trusts and say that actually with the right circle of trust in the room, we can actually break down some of these challenges that we have, that when we talk about beneficial ownership, like can we share beneficial ownership in some global aggregated database, and how's that go? Well, actually, how about if we just started with who would we really, for 80-20 rule, who would need to have access to that and share it with appropriately, that could make the 80% of the difference. So bottom line is, you know, yes, some of what you're probably hearing us talk about sounds like a dream, but if you break it down and you unpack these buckets, these are reasonable asks. It's reasonable to say SARs should be iterative, that there should be a feedback loop. That is a reasonable systemic ask. And if we take them in their buckets, we ought to be able to tackle this.
Matthew, can I just feed off that?
Sure,
'Cause, what Jay just said about cyber is really important for a couple of reasons. One, there is a blending and a realization that these risks around money laundering, sanctions, fraud, insider threat, cyber, corruption, all blend, right? And there are broader questions about how you design systems around that, how you think about data, and how you think about protecting the financial system as a result. But what's also interesting in terms of the public-private partnership question is that what you've seen in terms of innovation and advancement has been seen most aggressively in the cyber domain, precisely because the threats are coming from state, non-state actors, they're systemically relevant, and information sharing has to happen in real time often when you're talking about, you know, existential threats. And so one of the things we've talked about, and Jay, you've alluded to it, is the information sharing paradigms that have emerged, for example, from the FSISAC, the FSARC, or the Sheltered Harbor Project, which was born out of the Hamilton series of exercises looking at systemic risk to the financial system. That becomes a very interesting model because it's a recognition, starting kind of tabula rasa, you know, we've got to have a public-private paradigm that allows for information sharing between trusted actors quickly to allow common defense. And even where what you're seeing now is how do you do this in a multinational context? And so one of the things we've argued for from an American standpoint is why not begin to think about this with the Five Eyes countries? These are the most trusted intelligence partners for the United States. Why isn't there more dynamic information sharing among those five partners? And so there's different ways of framing this, and I think we can learn lessons from these other threat domains that have immediate application here. Matthew, one other thing I just have to say.
Sure.
I think one of the challenges that's coming is a challenge to the SAR system as the talisman and pillar to the system. And part of that is the technology, right? The ability to use non-rule-based systems, behavioral analysis, for example, to understand where risks are emerging, really does call into question the SAR as the core element of the system. Doesn't mean that SARs are irrelevant. It doesn't mean that they're not important for culture of compliance or awareness, all those things. But the next generation is going to be a design that doesn't have the SAR at the pillar, and the next generation of fixes is going to be less around tinkering, around making a better SAR system. It's going to be about a different system altogether.
Well, I mean, I would even challenge that it might well still be about the SAR, but it's about how we use the big data environments and the analytic tools that are now, you know, progressing at such incredible speed in terms of their complexity of what they can find in an anomaly space. That means that, you know, the huge cost and the false positive issue that has dragged the system down, how do we provide that information automatically to law enforcement? How do we provide them the education on how to use the tools? How do we provide them the tools that they can then sift through the information in an effective manner? And I think we don't want a big brother state, right? But I think if you look at some of the hashing and some of the double-blind stuff, even that was demonstrated at the recent tech sprint at the FCA in the UK, within a week, they develop technologies that provide that triple-blind ability to use this information. But it requires a really open regulator who's willing to engage and take some risk, because there is the need for the comfort in relation to cloud to process this type of information given the size, and the kind of tools that you really can only run on the cloud to make it effective in the long term. So I think for sure, the SAR, STR regimes will need to change, but will they die? I don't think they will. It's just how they are fed in and how they're analyzed might change radically with the technology.
And just building on that, what do you want to say?
Can I,
Yeah,
if I,
sure,
just,
go ahead.
I want to sort of raise, it sort of picks up a bit on what Jay said, and I agree entirely with everything you said, taking the dream apart into little pieces, right, and try to do that over time. I think there's another really important element that we, in the private sector in particular, really struggle with, which is the ability to declare victory. Okay, and I was at another discussion here yesterday where we were talking about the recent Chainalysis announcement around working with law enforcement on identifying this pornography ring, and I said we never get to do that. Right? We never get the opportunity to stand up with law enforcement and declare victory. And there are two really important issues here. One is to be able to say, we did X and it worked, right? To then say, let's all do that. The other is to then we are not the most favored industry, right? People don't like us very much. And certainly the private sector, to your point on your daughter, the questions I get from my daughter are, I was watching a television show and this woman inherited $8 million. Do you worry about that when that happens? And that goes into the bank account, right? So I thought it was good because she kind of got it. But anyway, but the other important thing is that I think it would be so monumental for our industry to have these opportunities to declare victory, to be able to come together and say, we actually are partners with law enforcement. We work with them all the time, but nobody knows, right?
I mean, that's good. Something about the report that you did do is there are some case studies, limited as they may be because they're not talked about, but at least a handful of them to point to say this does work. That, I think we need to have a mechanism through which, by the way, national legislators and regulators that could hear some of those stories that could then say, wow, if we could actually do that, we could scale this.
Yeah, and indeed, I think the report does point out a number of areas where if you had better information sharing, if you had better private sector, public sector collaboration, the results would have been different. I'm just wondering, just at the end, Marcus, if respond to some of these points as well, but is there a role as well for the FATF in doing that, in making it, on a global basis, a more effective means of transmitting that sort of information on where things would have gone better if there were more effective implementation of the FATF standards or changes?
I'm a little bit reluctant when you said you would start with the, how you call that, the 5 Eyes, and not have this global idea, right? Because don't we then drive the dirty money out of these jurisdictions to other jurisdictions, and we create islands, safe islands, and leave others, and it will be the weaker jurisdictions with the dirty money?
Well, one is sometimes that's why I said unbundle, because you have to start somewhere. And when we start talking about the world and global and multinational, again, you build on national successes and then you start to connect them. And it doesn't mean that your dream isn't absolutely to go global, but we have situations where not every entity in the world can be put in the room and really get things done and feel comfortable fully collaborating. So, building on 5 Eyes, and I think the reason why 5 Eyes in the cyber world is so interesting and effective is because the pace at which collaboration has to happen to be effective is so digital, is so immediate, that those mechanisms are pre-established in a way that the financial crime side, I think, could, I don't want to say learn from, but certainly replicate and think about the, now granted, we were just talking about this internally at Citi, they don't have the legacy of 1970s to now. They were able to establish in the new digital world right away some of the things that they're facing. So yes, you're right. But then again, 80-20 rule, if big banks and some of the more important actors were collaborating much better, some of these largest multinational actors would get hit really hard real fast.
But I mean, I think the great promise of technology is, right, for those and the capacity building efforts of, the fund, the bank, the UN, ODP, and even the Wolfsburg Group, if you provide the right technology for that smaller country whose FIU have 3 people who do not have the bandwidth to do this analytics, and we give them that tool, and suddenly they can sift through their 10,000 reports in 10 minutes instead of 20 years, suddenly then the whole tide can rise across the world, and
I think
that's the hope.
I think we could talk about this all day. Certainly with this group. I'm sorry, the time has. Please wrap up. I will be very. Anyway, so it's wonderful. I think we're very much everyone's on the same page. Collaboration, public sector cooperation, very, very important. And it's been a great panel, very insightful. Thank you very much. Please join in thanking the participants.